Great, thank you very much. Firstly, I should state I'm not a property underwriter, so I don't set premiums. I work as a risk consultant and I don't represent the insurance industry. I work for CHUBB Insurance Australia Limited, and it's basically presenting our views today. So when I go second, it's always good to go second because I can actually modify my presentation. And a lot of the slides are put together not knowing what Jonathan's going to be presenting, so there's a little bit of overlap. I will be skimming through some of those presentations, so if I move too fast or make you dizzy, just tell me to stop, slow down, okay? But basically I work with a team of 400 risk engineers or risk consultants, and we assess risk on behalf of the underwriter. And we feed that information into the underwriter, and together with the insurance broker, they set the premium and the coverage. CHUBB Insurance Australia Limited are a major or leading insurance of residential strata buildings, and we have been for many years. So just a little bit of background. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's not a new issue. It's been around for over 30 years. We've had combustible cladding on buildings for that long. And as you know, the higher the building gets, the more difficult it is to fight a fire involving cladding. The most important thing you need to consider, though, we're not just assessing the outer skin, we're looking at the entire facade system. So what's behind the cladding? And it's only the large-scale testing that we can look at that aspect and truly predict how a building is going to perform. So we're not just looking at the outer skin, we're looking at the insulation behind it. And in some cases that may be combustible, as in the case of Grenfell. Now, unfortunately, as an insurer, we expect buildings to be built that comply with the building codes. In this case, we're now seeing many buildings that don't comply. So that makes our job a little bit more difficult to sell to everyone here and trying to sell those increased premiums. And for people that have seen increased premiums, hopefully I can sort of work through some of that and how we've assessed and how we've arrived at some of those premiums. So how do we get into this mess? So basically, you know, Jonathan talked about the compliance issues, but really it only came to attention with the Lacrosse building fire and also Grenfell. So they really drove this issue. The insurance industry is very reactive to large losses or large fires, and we tend to respond and look at how we manage that exposure. But some of the interesting findings from the Victorian Cladding Taskforce, when I read that report, basically it was pretty obvious that some products were marketed incorrectly. They were using terminology like FR, fire resistive, or fire retardant. No one really knew what that meant. So people were thinking that this product was okay to install, but it wasn't. It wasn't tested to a large-scale test. It was tested to a small-scale test. We didn't know how it was going to perform. Now, Jonathan talked about the small-scale test, so I won't mention that again. But there's also was a lack of understanding from the building surveyors on what they were signing off. So it's only now we've had that loss experience. We've also had the large-scale testing that we're learning more, and we're learning more as more tests are being conducted. So I won't talk about Grenfell again, apart from it was quite a unique situation. We had an outer skin of combustible PE, we had an inner skin of combustible insulation, and we had an air gap in between, which caused a chimney effect, which basically spread the fire throughout the building, both horizontally and vertically. In most cases in Victoria, we don't see a lot of that combination, and hopefully, and we don't see a lot of fires, mind you, hopefully we won't see many more that come in the future either. So some of the other fires, the Torch fire was a good example. Torch building, 2 fires in 2.5 years. So hopefully not another one, but who knows. Lacrosse, Jonathan talked about that. Some of the things that I look at, we look at how the building performed. We looked at the post-loss incident report from the fire brigade. And we saw some interesting things. We saw that the sprinkler system actually outperformed its design. So you're probably not aware, but fire sprinkler systems in buildings are only designed for residential buildings, 4 sprinklers to operate. Only 4. So if you get more than 4 operating, the systems can be overtaxed. And that's why we get concerned about, okay, it's a sprinkler building, we're getting vertical fire spread on the outside of the building, it's going inside the building, we get 20 sprinklers operating, there's not going to be a lot of water coming out of 20 sprinklers. And all of a sudden, that system fails. Now, we're also, in conjunction with the Owners Corp, taking action against the building designers, the builder, building surveyor, and the fire engineer in this case for that building. We've spent about $7 million repairing the building so far. There's a cost estimate to replace the remaining combustible cladding. So this building's had combustible cladding for the last 4 years. They haven't removed it. So we're taking action to get that done. There's been cost estimates of upwards of $13 million to replace the cladding. But I have seen a more recent cost estimate of about $6 million. So obviously the contractor's trying to take advantage of that situation as well. Now, as Jonathan mentioned, there's different types of cladding, and it's really hard for me to determine what's on the building if we haven't got the data sheets. So in some cases, we take a conservative approach. We assume that it's PE. Okay. So with the core materials, Jonathan mentioned it's either PE or a mixture of PE and mineral fibre, or a non-combustible or a limited combustible material. So how do we identify that? So the way I prefer is to drill holes in the cladding. So we drill a 50mm core hole. Well, I don't personally. We get a contractor or your handyman to do that. We look at the core of the material. We look at what's behind the material. So we look at the insulation and the substrate. And from that, we can use some engineering judgment based on the large-scale fire test and what's going to happen. So with if you're looking at the building and if you want to have a look yourself, if the core is black, it's most likely PE, so therefore combustible. If it's a light grey to whitish colour, it's got some sort of mineral fibre blend. Is that correct, Jonathan? Most of the time, yeah. But if we're not sure, we send it off to our testing laboratories to be verified. And that comes at a cost as well. So there's, at the moment, there's 3 testing laboratories recognised by the Insurance Council of Australia. And they all will do that for you for a fee. And that fee, I think, is around $1,000 to $2,000.
2 to 3,000.
2 to 3, so I was out by 1,000. Yeah. So, but preferably we get all the documentation. But we have seen cases where there's been product substitution as well. So on the specification, there was a certain type of product that was meant to be installed in the building, but what was actually installed was something completely different. Now, Jonathan talked about the different test criteria that we assess. So we recognise the 3 large-scale fire tests that are listed up here. We don't recognise the small-scale 1530 Part 3 as a suitable test, and there's also a medium test to NFPA, and we don't recognise that. We do consider the results, but as a medium scale, we don't believe it will give a true indication on how the building's going to perform. So basically, in more recent times, there's more limited combustibility materials. Most cladding materials are combustible. Some will burn a lot quicker than others, or burn more and more ferociously. So if your building's built recently, there may be a chance that it is actually a limited combustibility building, and we accept that type of cladding under certain situations, which are if they're fire sprinkler protected. So we've listed basically, when we look at the different cladding types, we've sort of broken them down into acceptable, so less than 10% combustible material in the core. Limited combustibility, we're sort of working to less than 30%, and then above 30% for the rest. So you may see some brand names there. So these are all ACP aluminium composite panel cladding products. And it's quite interesting. So some of the A2 products, the Alucobond A2 has been around for a long time, but no one used it because it was too expensive. So they use the cheaper PE product. So some of the things that I look for when we assess the level of risk on a building, obviously it's combustibility of the cladding, it's the extent of the cladding on the building. So if you only got a small amount of cladding on the building, I wouldn't be too concerned at all, especially if it's down at low level. So from my perspective, from an insurance perspective, we believe that that fire can be controlled by the fire brigade on a low-rise building. Now, that assumes we've got access to all elevations of the building, obviously. Some of the other factors are the vertical and horizontal continuity. So Jonathan talked about fire breaks, so we do look at that. Unfortunately, we haven't got enough data to work out what is a reasonable fire break. So at the moment, we're working to about 3 floors. In most cases, we've got a vertical column of cladding right up the building. So therefore, we've got that path, the fire, to potentially spread from the inside of the building or from a balcony to the outside of the building and spread up the building. And once it spreads up the building, there's very little chance of fighting that. So buildings over 25 metres, we're more concerned about because that's the sort of the limitations of the firefighting appliances, which is about 8 floors roughly. We do look at the occupancy. So for non-residential buildings, we look at office buildings versus residential. We deem residential as being worse than office because you've got cooking equipment and more hazards, more activities on balconies. We do look at the fire brigade access. Sorry, I can't read the notes on the table here, so I'll have to refer to the screen. Things like essential safety measures, fire systems are maintained correctly, working correctly. The likelihood of spread from an adjoining building as well. So if you've got a neighbouring building that's not protected, could have a fire in that building, could spread to your building and upside the outside of the building. We do consider the loss scenarios. So when we determine our level of risk, we do take a lot of consideration about, okay, what is our worst case scenario? How far the fire is spread? What damage will it cause? So in some cases, when we looked at if you compare a building that hasn't got cladding versus a building that has got cladding, our loss scenarios are 5 times higher for a building with cladding. So therefore, we either accept the risk and hold it in-house, or we have to offset that risk by buying reinsurance. So we buy insurance from a reinsurer to protect our capital, and that comes at a cost. And unfortunately, we have to share that cost with yourselves. So the likelihood of a fire. So what is the likelihood? So basically we're looking at the high risk areas. So we consider those to be balconies or cladding at street level. They're the 2 main high risk areas for me. So if your balcony's got fire sprinkler protection, that's a better situation to be in. If they don't, and you've got barbecues, you've got gas-fired heaters, you've got other things going on, you've got maybe Airbnb having parties all the time on the balconies, overcrowding, housekeeping issues, then there is an increased risk of fire. If the building is not protected by fire sprinklers, there's a risk of fire spreading from inside to outside. So that needs to be considered as well. So these are some of the buildings we sort of look at. So this is a building located in New South Wales. So we've got cladding vertically up that spine of the building. We've got it horizontally. If I was looking at a loss estimate for this one without the cladding, it's probably about $2 million. You have a small fire, sprinkler systems go off, water damage. So, worst case, we're up for maybe $2-3 million. For this one here, we could have upwards of $60 million. So there's a huge difference in risk. So what's our position on this? So basically at CHUBB we decided that we need to try and manage this risk as best we can. We need to support our clients as best we can. There were some markets that walked away from this issue and didn't provide any insurance at all. We have done that, but unfortunately in some cases we've had to increase the premium because the level of risk has changed. So I mentioned before about comparison with our loss scenarios, what could happen, worst case. We're looking at the likelihood of the event. So if you've got good management in place, you're controlling the hazards, obviously that's important. So we look at fire safety actions. What are you doing to control that? So in most cases where we have got cladding on building, we will sort of go out there, complete an assessment, or provide recommendations on how you should treat that. Now, obviously, we need guidance from the fire engineers, like Jonathan, to sort of verify some of our assumptions. But basically, we're now looking at reducing that continuity. So if we did have something going wrong, it's going to be contained to an area that can be controlled. And that's obviously better than replacing all the combustible cladding on the building. The thing that we look for that's different to the building codes is the building codes are based on life safety essentially and not property protection. We do consider the property protection component. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. We're ensuring the property and the liability. So we want to make sure the building is safe for you to occupy, but we also want to make sure that once you do evacuate the building doesn't burn down. So what fire safety actions can you take can take place? And I know the MFB have put together some good tips on their website. But they include obviously making sure that fire safety systems are working correctly. Fire exits are clear, they're not chocked open, the doors are not chocked open. You sort of try and manage the high-risk activities on the balconies. Things like barbecues, ignition sources. I know it's very difficult for some buildings to do that, but it makes a big difference for us if you can demonstrate that you're controlling those. Now, if your building does have cladding, and I'm assuming most people have or may have some cladding on their building, I've listed some of the steps that I sort of tend to advise our clients what to do. But first thing is not to panic. Number one, okay, so because it can vary greatly from a risk point of view, okay. So firstly, confirm what type of cladding it is. Review if it's installed in high-risk areas, so looking at level of risk. Ensure the building is safe to occupy. Have the building assessed by a registered fire safety practitioner, fire safety engineer. We have a questionnaire for CHUBB Insureds. We have a questionnaire that we'd like you to complete, and that gives us a bit of a snapshot of the level of risk. And we can then decide what advice and what if we need to meet with you to go through some of the risk treatment options. We do look at the cost of treatment versus the cost of insurance as well, so you can make that assessment, so the cost benefit. I've got a note here down the bottom, Victoria Cladding Replacement Loan Scheme, which is, for me, I'm not really sure how that's going to work. I don't know if you've sort of made any inquiries regarding that, but I doubt that it's going to work that well, but I don't know that much about it, but we'll wait to see. And certainly Mark's going to talk about, hopefully, some of the sort of the legal actions you can take. We are taking action at the moment with the OC on La Crosse. There will be a decision early next year, and that'll be the precedent for a lot of future cases, I believe. So if you need to do any further reading, there's a lot of information on the internet. Victorian Building Authority, Insurance Council Australia, MFB, our website, our risk bulletins. And basically that's who we are.